Welcome to the third of our 2020 LORTA Design Workshop videos. My name's Martin Prowse. I work as an evaluation specialist in the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund. And today, my colleague Dr. Clementine Sedania and I will be taking you through how to develop evaluation questions and indicators for your impact evaluation. The presentation has two parts. Firstly, I'll be running through how assessing impact requires identifying the right evaluation questions to investigate. So for this part of the presentation, we'll be developing and refining evaluation questions for your impact evaluation. The second part of the presentation focuses on measuring impact and about how, when you do this, you need to identify relevant indicators. And Clementine will be taking you through this second part of the presentation and will be helping you develop and refine smart indicators for your project. So when you define key evaluation questions, you go through 5 main steps. Firstly, you identify project interventions and their aims. For example, as Emil explained in the last video, we're working on the theory of change from cookstove projects. And for the cookstove project example, the aims of the impact evaluation firstly assesses what problem the project is seeking to solve. It also assesses what the proposed interventions are of the project, the activities. And thirdly, it assesses what these interventions aim to achieve, the outcomes. So for the cookstove project, the problem that the project is seeking to solve is that cooking over open fires contributes to ill health, emissions, and degradation. The proposed intervention of the project, the activities, are twofold. Firstly, training in the use of fuel-efficient cookstoves, and secondly, in improving access to relevant models of cookstove. And what outcomes do these interventions aim to achieve? Well, firstly, the intervention aims to reduce indoor pollution and improve health outcomes, so these are adaptation co-benefits. And secondly, in terms of mitigation, the intervention aims to contribute to a reduced use of fuel wood, reduced emissions, and reduced land degradation. Here you can see the theory of change that Emil introduced last week for the cookstove project. You can see that we start with an activity, which is that an efficient cookstove scheme is established. The output is that people use efficient cookstoves. The first set of outcomes are that indoor pollution reduces and that less biomass is needed. The intermediate outcomes are reduced greenhouse gas emissions and better health. And this leads to the impact of the project, which is, in this example of the cookstove project, an improved quality of life. The evaluation questions are the high-level overarching questions that an impact evaluation is designed to answer. So having a set of key evaluation questions that everyone, all stakeholders agree on, allow us to decide what data to collect, what evaluation strategy to choose, and what sample to select. And for impact evaluations, the overarching question that all projects are aiming for is, what is the causal effect of the programme on outcomes of interest? So, here are some examples of overarching key evaluation questions for the cookstove project. What is the impact of the cook stove project on indoor air pollution, on household health, and on the use of fuel wood? An impact evaluation allows us to accept or reject null hypotheses based on these key evaluation questions. For example, the null hypotheses for the first question would be the cook stove project has no impact on the use of fuel wood. If, after the project evaluation has been completed, we find a statistically significant difference between beneficiaries and households in a comparison group, and that there are no systematic differences between the beneficiary group and the comparison group, or that we've controlled for these systematic differences using statistical methods, we're able to say with a high degree of confidence that the impact of the project has been a reduction in the use of fuel wood, or a reduction in indoor air pollution, or has had a positive impact on household health, hopefully. But it must be feasible to answer these questions and to answer these null hypotheses. And to make this happen, we formulate specific questions for each step of the theory of change. So, for the activities, what are the characteristics of the cook stove scheme? For outputs, are participants using the cook stoves? For initial outcomes, what type of fuel are participants using? For intermediate outcomes, are participants using less fuel? Is their health improving? And in terms of impact, do participants have a higher quality of life? Step 2 in defining your key evaluation questions is to identify existing evidence on these interventions. For example, for the cook stove project, we can look at existing evidence, and we can find a recent study that focused on the promotion of improved cook stoves. And the findings from this study suggest that market analysis, robust supply chains, and price discounts are critical for cook stove diffusion. Another study focuses on adoption of cook stove. Here, the study shows that adoption studies highlight how these types of studies are scarce, scattered, and of differential quality, and that further studies need to be conducted to assess contextual factors. And a third study focuses on adoption and sustained use of improved cook stoves. This study highlighted that once adopted, new cook stoves are often used for some cooking tasks, but not all of them. Monitoring long-term use patterns via sensors is important, the paper argues, particularly to increase scale-up. The paper also argues that there's a need to assess the relative advantage of cook stoves for common cooking practices and types of fuel. So overall, what does the existing evidence say about these interventions? Firstly, that adoption depends on markets, on context, on cooking practices, and on types of fuel, and that there's need for long-term monitoring to be able to make claims about impact. And how important is context in terms of the impact of this intervention? Well, if adoption depends on contextual factors, such as markets, cooking styles, types of wood, how likely is it that impact will also depend on context? Well, it's highly likely. So context is a critical element to assess. The third step in defining your key evaluation questions is to check the underlying assumptions of the theory of change. The assumptions link the different sections of your theory of change. So when we look at our theory of change from the cook stove project, on first glance, we can assume that it's correct, but we're relying on a set of assumptions. So checking the underlying assumptions of the theory of change relies on looking at the program from the perspective of the intended beneficiaries. How would beneficiaries know about the program? How would they understand it? Why should beneficiaries participate? What can prevent their participation? And what can cause participants to drop out from an intervention? And this requires focusing on the links between the steps of the theory of change. For example, the link between the activities and the outputs. We need to assess whether intended beneficiaries attend the training sessions, and adopt the cook stoves. In terms of the link between the outputs and the initial outcomes, we need to assess whether adopters use cook stoves regularly, that they're suitable for conventional cooking practices. In terms of the link between initial outcomes and intermediary outcomes, we need to assess whether cook stoves are used in the manner they're intended for in terms of location and maintenance. And in terms of the link between intermediate outcomes and impact, we need to assess whether improvements in health to contribute to an improved quality of life are not undermined by other risky health behaviour. So the underlying assumptions of a theory of change serve as the basis for formulating subsidiary research questions, or in this case, subsidiary evaluation questions. Have beneficiaries attended training sessions and adopted cook stove? Have adopters used cook stoves regularly over an extended period of time? Are cook stoves suitable for cooking practices? Are cook stoves used as expected? So subsidiary evaluation questions assist the evaluation team to see where along the theory of change the intervention may not have worked as expected. Step 4 for defining your key evaluation questions is to define the main objectives of the impact evaluation itself. Why is your project conducting an impact evaluation? How will the impact evaluation improve the project? How will this be operationalized? And who are the main stakeholders that need to be consulted? No project and no impact evaluation is an island. They all rely on multiple overlapping relationships with key stakeholder groups, including beneficiaries, implementers, government agencies, and more. And getting the buy-in and support of all of these key stakeholders is key. Step 5 is to validate and refine your evaluation questions with these stakeholders. And at this stage, each project and each impact evaluation needs to think through what is the best way of engaging stakeholders so they have a sense of ownership. How can you set expectations? And how does this influence the choice of your evaluation questions? So far, I've run through why assessing impact requires identifying the right evaluation questions to investigate. And we've covered material that supports you in developing and refining evaluation questions for your impact evaluation. Now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Clementine Sedania, for the second part of this video, which will highlight how measuring impact of an intervention requires identifying relevant indicators. Over to you, Sedania.
So thank you, Martin, for this great talk and introduction. Hi everyone, I am Dr. Clementine Sedania, and I will give the rest of the talk on how to define good indicators. So let me start by asking you, how satisfied are you with the presentation so far? So let's look at the gauge. So here the gauge is my indicator, that is, your level of satisfaction halfway through the presentation on evaluation questions and indicators. Its value indicates rather satisfied. Okay, not too bad then. But I still hope that we can increase this indicator during the rest of the talk. So far, we discussed how to define the evaluation questions of your project. Now, we are interested in how to answer these questions, and this is what indicators are here for. For each question, we need to define indicators that will allow you to measure the change you are interested in. So in case you are not clear with its definition, an indicator is a factor or a variable that can be measured objectively. Let's take an example. If we take the question, do household health improve as a result of using efficient cook stove? What kind of indicator could you consider? Come on, I'm waiting for your suggestion. Respondents' health. So one of you suggests respondents' health. Alright, what do you think about that? Is this a well-defined indicator? I'm sorry, but the answer is no. It is not. So what is missing then? Not only your evaluation team needs to be smart, but your indicators as well. The difference here is that SMART stands for specific, measurable, attributable, realistic, and targeted. These are 5 criteria that make an indicator well defined. Let's go over each of them. So, specific means that the indicator should measure the information required as closely as possible. Measurable means that it should ensure that the information can be readily obtained, and this is usually in a numerical form. Attributable means that it should ensure that each measure is linked to the project's efforts. Realistic is about ensuring that the data can be obtained in a timely fashion, with reasonable frequency and at a reasonable cost. Finally, targeted means that the indicator should refer to the objective population. Let's now go back to our example. Is respondents' health specific enough? Actually, no, it is too vague. Who are actually the intended respondents? What do we mean about health? What is considered as good or bad health? Do we really need to know about overall health, or only about the dimensions of health that can be affected by efficient cook stove? Let's move to the second SMART criterion. Is respondents' health measurable? Well, yes and no. It can be, but how it is measured should be clear in the name of the indicator. There are many possible ways to measure overall health. For example, respondents could undergo a medical checkup. This would correspond to an expert assessment. You could also directly ask respondents about their health status, as I ask you about your level of satisfaction. And this will correspond to a self-reported health status. Another possibility is to collect data on visits to health centers. In this case, your indicator will be the number of visits to health centers. And there are even more options. You can already see how these measures differ. The first example corresponds to an objective measure, while the second to self-perceptions. This means that this second measure may be subjective, as the assessment may differ across respondents with similar level of health. The final example corresponds to actions taken by individuals. However, not all sick individuals may seek treatment in health centers. In any case, remember that you also need to specify the period of reference. For example, how will you assess your overall level of health during the last 12 months? The answer may differ if we ask instead about the last 7 days or about the last 24 hours. Third criterion. Is respondents' health an attributable indicator. By that we mean, can we directly link the use of efficient cook stove to this kid's health status that we propose to measure by how well it danced during the interview? Here again, the answer is no. This indicator is too broad. You have to be specific to think about the specific pathways that link the use of efficient cook stoves to users' health. And in this case, this goes essentially through a reduction in air pollution. Then, what are possible shorter-term effects of air pollution on health? This affects respiratory problems and pulmonary disease. So, focusing on this dimension of health will make us better able to link the observed changes to the use of cook stoves. Note that we focused on shorter-term effects here. This is because you are interested in knowing the effects of your project at the end of a project and not necessarily in 10 or 20 years after its end. This is of course also interesting, but maybe not your immediate objective. Related to this, is our indicator realistic? When you decide to think about an indicator, you also need to think about feasibility, so about potential ethical concerns and sensitivity issues, about your time frame, and also about your budget. Overall, you need to select data sources that are the most realistic to aim for. In the case there is not enough existing data that could answer your questions and that you need to collect your own data, which is very likely the case, you need to think about the relevant timing. Remember that to be able to observe large enough changes, it is better to select indicators that can react quickly to the project's interventions. Last but not least, is our indicator targeted? Still not. The population of interest is not defined here. Note that you may not be interested in people that will not be affected by the use of cook stoves because they are never using them or never near them when they are being used. To sum up, using only one of the SMART criteria is not enough. We need to combine all of them to define a good indicator. The SMART criteria will help you define which indicators are relevant for your specific project. And note that multiple indicators can be used to answer the same question in order to provide a more complete picture of complex pathways. And so what now? What is then a good indicator of better health for this project? So, no need to prolong the suspense any longer. Here are some possible answers. So, you could look at self-reported respiratory symptoms of a household member mainly responsible for cooking in the week preceding the survey. So, this will include having a sore throat outside of cooking, having a bad cough outside of cooking, difficulty breathing, and so on. You could also consider the number of days this person reported the following symptoms after cooking, and that during the week preceding the survey. So that includes irritated eyes, headache, bad coughs, or sore throat. And these examples are taken for the paper mentioned here. So overall, you need to define indicators for each of your evaluation questions. To do so, you can start exploring key indicators that are used by other organizations and in research in a similar sector. Then you need to tailor these indicators to your context and check if they are smart. Also, be careful of black boxes. If you decide to use an index, you should define clearly how it will be built. Finally, make also sure that one indicator corresponds to a single level of your theory of change. Let's go back to the theory of change. it needs indicators for each of its blocks. And if you go back to our example, here are some possible indicators. So, to measure the efficient cook-stove scheme being established, you can use the type of cook-stove being distributed to the household. For the use of cook-stoves, you can look at the number of times the efficient cook-stoves have been used the last 7 days. For an indicator of less biomass needed, you can turn to the number of woodlots used for cooking in the last month. As an indicator of greenhouse gas emission, you could measure exposure to carbon monoxide during a cooking test. And finally, as an indicator of better life, you could consider the self-reported level of satisfaction with current life. But then, you also need indicators within each block of a theory of change, and this to test its assumptions. For instance, from step 1 to step 2, you could measure the number of individuals attending training on how to use efficient cook-stove. From step 2 to step 3, a quality assessment of a cook-stoves could be conducted by experts. From step 3 to step 4, you could look at whether changes in the total number of meals being cooked by the households have been reported. Finally, from step 4 to step 5, you could look at reported changes in preventive health behavior. Okay, now you know everything about smart indicators. The last step is where to get data from. As a first step, you need to assess whether secondary sources could be suitable, available, and also reliable to obtain data on your indicators. You could look at data produced by the ministry or the project accredited entity. You could also use your own company data if you are a private firm. You could turn to feasibility studies conducted for the project, or to administrative data, such as the number of admissions to hospital. You could also turn to existing household or other-level surveys, or also use geographic information systems such as rainfalls and vegetation cover. Overall, there are many other possibilities as far as secondary sources are concerned. A first screening is important to avoid duplicating data and so to avoid wasting people's time and money. However, the perfect data on our specific needs and population is rarely available, and you often have to conduct your own data collection. So to do so, you need to define who should be the respondents, where to get them, and how many should take part of the survey. You also need to define which type of data is the most suitable to your indicator, notably if it is quantitative or qualitative information. You also need to decide on the frequency and mode of data collection. For instance, are these going to be part of monitoring data collection or of a separate household survey? Is the information going to be recorded in the form of observational notes, or are you going to use paper or computer-based interviews? So these are decisions that make you redefine your indicators in case you realize that they were not realistic enough. So you see it's a bit of an iterative process. Alright, so I think this is far from enough information on this topic for today. Thank you so much for your attention, and we are looking forward to your questions and feedback. Bye-bye.